Hey guys, tonight we journey back, deep into the heart of a medieval winter. A time when survival wasn't just a goal, it was a daily, bone-chilling miracle. Imagine the wind, a relentless, icy predator, gnawing at any exposed inch of skin. Snow falls not in gentle flakes, but as a blinding, determined curtain trying to erase the world. You're there, and let's be honest, without a sturdy stone building and some clever, divine intervention in a pint glass, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to see where you're all tuning in from tonight, so drop your location and local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The world around you fades, not to black, but to a biting, relentless grey. An endless expanse of snow stretches in every direction. The wind its only sculptor, carving sharp, unforgiving dunes where yesterday there might have been a path or perhaps a field. You trudge onward, each step a monumental effort, your boots crunching with a dull, protesting sound against the frozen crust. The cold is a physical presence, a heavy cloak woven from ice and despair that settles deep into your bones. Your fingers, tucked away somewhere in mittens that lost their fight with the frost hours ago, are so numb you're pretty sure they're considering early retirement, perhaps planning a new life somewhere tropical, far from your current predicament. Your breath plumes out in ragged white clouds, snatched away instantly by the gale that seems to have a personal vendetta against your ears, whipping and roaring as if trying to steal your very thoughts. Visibility is a cruel joke. The sky is a low, oppressive sheet of bruised purple and angry grey, occasionally spitting more sleet and snow just to remind you who's boss. You pull your scarf tighter, a flimsy barrier against the onslaught, but the cold finds its way in, seeping through fabric, through leather, through your very will. How long have you been walking? Hours? Days? Time itself seems to have frozen. Each moment an eternity of stinging cheeks and aching limbs. Your nose has decided it's now an abstract ice sculpture. A bold artistic choice, really, but not particularly helpful for breathing. You scan the horizon, or what you imagine is the horizon through the swirling snow, searching for any sign, any break in this desolate white monotony. Just as a sliver of hopelessness begins to truly set in, a dark, almost imperceptible smudge appears against the whiteness. At first, you think it's a trick of the eye, a phantom conjured by a mind desperate for rescue. But as you stumble closer, driven by a renewed, albeit fragile, flicker of hope, the smudge solidifies. It resolves into definite shapes, towering, angular, and undeniably man-made. Stone, dark, unyielding stone, rising from the frozen earth, like a forgotten promise. It's a monastery. Or it's the world's largest, grumpiest hedgehog made of stone. At this point, you're hoping for monks. Hedgehogs are notoriously bad at sharing their winter stores, especially beer. The sheer scale of it becomes apparent as you draw nearer. This isn't just a building, it's a fortress against the wilderness, a bastion of civilization in a world determined to reclaim everything. The walls are immense, thick and solid, constructed from massive blocks of stone that look like they were quarried by giants and set in place by sheer willpower. Many such monastic establishments, you recall hearing, were intentionally built in these remote, challenging locations, a testament to their founders' desire for solitude and self-sufficiency. These were not men who shied away from a bit of hard work, or evidently a rather aggressive climate. The wind howls around the corners of the structure, but the walls themselves stand impassive, unbent, a stark contrast to your own shivering form. There are few windows visible from this approach, and those that are present are small, narrow slits, more like defensive emplacements than welcoming openings. It's clear this place was built to endure, to keep the wildness of the world out, and perhaps to keep the sanctity within protected. You follow the curve of the massive wall, searching for an entrance, the snowdrifts deepening against its base, making your progress even more treacherous. Finally, you see it, a great archway set deep within the stone, leading to a pair of enormous wooden doors, banded with iron that has long since rusted to a deep, earthy red. This is the gatehouse, the primary point of controlled entry. Historians still argue whether the formidable gatehouses of medieval monasteries were designed more for defense against unwelcome intruders or as carefully controlled portals for extending Christian charity to weary travelers. Looking at it now, teeth chattering, you're really hoping for the latter. Summoning the last of your strength, you reach out a trembling hand towards the door. You notice a small, intricately carved wooden panel set beside the main gate. Perhaps some sort of signal, but you opt for a more direct approach, rapping your knuckles against the solid oak. The sound seems pathetically small, swallowed by the wind and the sheer mass of wood and stone. You knock again, louder this time, a desperate tattoo against the unyielding surface, hoping someone inside isn't in the middle of a very important, monastic nap, or a particularly absorbing manuscript. For a moment, there's only the shriek of the wind. Then, a faint scraping sound from within, the distinct thud of a heavy bar being lifted. One of the massive doors groans open, just a crack at first, revealing a sliver of darkness, and then the cautious face of a monk, his hood pulled low, his eyes assessing you. You probably look like a half-frozen snowdrift with legs. He doesn't immediately swing the door wide. Instead, you notice his gaze flick to a small reinforced opening in the door itself, a kind of grill or slot, barely noticeable from the outside. Some monasteries called this a Judas window, a clever, if slightly suspicious, medieval peephole, allowing the porter a good look at visitors before committing to opening up. It was a practical measure in an era where not every knock heralded a friend. Apparently, your wretched state passes muster, or perhaps it's just too cold to leave even a potential brigand outside to freeze. With another groan of protesting wood and metal, the door opens wider, enough for you to stumble through. You pass, from the relentless, screaming white of the storm into the relative calm and deep shadow of a stone passageway. The wind's roar is instantly muffled, reduced to a distant moan. It's still cold in here. Stone passageways in winter are hardly tropical, but it's a still cold, a quiet cold, blessedly free of that biting, malicious wind. The air smells different too, faintly of wood smoke, old stone, and something else, something indefinable, but not unpleasant. Hope, perhaps. Or maybe just the absence of wolf. You're in. You're inside the monastery walls. The first hurdle towards surviving this medieval winter has been cleared. Now, to find warmth, and perhaps, just perhaps, something to thaw your very soul. The monk who opened the door, Brother Thomas you'll later learn, though communication is sparse to put it mildly, gestures for you to follow. He doesn't speak, not a word of welcome, not a query about your near-death experience in the blizzard. It's not rudeness you sense, but a profound economy of speech, as if words themselves are a precious commodity not to be squandered. Perhaps they have a daily word quota, and he's saving his for a particularly riveting discussion on the merits of turnips later. You shuffle after him, your half-frozen limbs protesting with every step, moving deeper into the labyrinthine heart of the monastery. The passage opens into a covered walkway, a cloister, framing a central courtyard now blanketed in pristine snow. The architecture is stark, imposing, yet possesses a serene, almost severe beauty. Everything is stone. Stone floors, stone walls, stone arches supporting a stone-flagged roof above the walkway. It's like being inside a giant, very well-organized fridge. The silence here is different from the silence of the storm. That was a screaming void. This is a silence filled with unspoken purpose, with the quiet hum of disciplined lives. You notice other monks gliding like spectres in their dark, heavy woolen habits, moving with a deliberate, unhurried pace. They don't look at you, or if they do, it's with a fleeting, incurious glance. It's as if a half-frozen stranger, appearing out of a blizzard, is just another Tuesday. Maybe it is. You begin to understand that this entire place, every stone, Every action, every breath is governed by something immense, something ancient, the rule. Specifically, the rule of Saint Benedict. This foundational text, written way back around 516 AD, became the blueprint for Western monasticism, a comprehensive guide to communal living dedicated to prayer and work. And when Benedict said guide, he wasn't suggesting a friendly pamphlet with helpful tips. He meant a serious, life-defining instruction manual. The core principle, you'll come to grasp, is ora et labora, prayer and work. These are the twin pillars upon which their entire existence is built, a rhythm that dictates every hour of every day, winter or summer, blizzard or sunshine. The ora, the prayer, is structured around the divine office, a cycle of 8 prayer services that punctuate the day and night. You'll soon become acutely aware of the bells, their solemn tones calling the community to worship with unwavering regularity. It starts with vigils or matins in the deep dark hours of the night. Imagine being hauled out of your warmish bed around 2 a.m. to go chant in a freezing chapel. No snooze buttons in the 12th century, sadly. Then comes Lauds at dawn, followed by prime around 6 a.m., terce at mid-morning, sext at midday, none in the mid-afternoon, vespers as evening approaches, and finally, compline before retiring for the night. Each service involves psalms, hymns, readings from scripture. It's a constant, relentless immersion in the sacred, designed to keep the monks' minds focused on the divine. And between these pillars of prayer comes the labora, the work. No monk was to be idle. Idleness, according to Saint Benedict, was the enemy of the soul. So, they worked. Hard. Even in the depths of winter, there was much to be done. You might see monks in the scriptorium, their fingers blue with cold, hunched over desks, painstakingly copying manuscripts by the flickering light of a tallow candle. Each stroke of the quill pen, a deliberate act of preservation, ensuring that knowledge, religious texts, classical literature, even treatises on agriculture or medicine, survived the so-called Dark Ages. Remember that book you flicked through on your phone earlier? These guys were the original human photocopiers, just with more chanting and significantly less reliable Wi-Fi. Others would be engaged in essential crafts, tailoring and mending their simple woolen habits, cobbling, shoes, carpentry, blacksmithing. The monastery aimed for self-sufficiency, a closed loop where almost everything needed for survival was produced within its walls. In warmer months, vast fields would be cultivated, vineyards tended. Now, in winter, the work might involve repairing tools, milling grain stored from the autumn harvest, tending to any sheltered livestock, or perhaps, as you're particularly hoping, some very important brewing tasks. The quiet you initially registered is punctuated by the distant rhythmic clang of a hammer, the scrape of a tool on wood, the rustle of pages turning, the subtle soundtrack of industriousness. The daily grind is, frankly, astonishing. There's a profound order to it all, a sense of shared purpose that's almost palpable. The monks eat together in silence in the refectory, often while one of their number reads aloud from a religious text. Conversation is minimal, restricted to essential communication. Historians still argue whether the profound commitment to this austere lifestyle stemmed purely from intense spiritual devotion, or if the undeniable security and structure offered by the monastery in a chaotic world played a more significant role for many. It was, after all, a guaranteed roof over your head, and usually food in your belly, which was more than many outside these walls could claim. As Brother Thomas leads you towards what you hope is a source of warmth, you pass a stern-faced monk who seems to be observing the general proceedings with a particularly keen eye. This might be one of the circatories, sometimes referred to as the deans or provosts of the monastery. Their job was to make rounds, especially during work hours or study periods, to ensure that no monk was succumbing to idleness, engaging in frivolous chatter, or, heaven forbid, sneaking an unauthorized nap in the library stacks. It's like having a very serious, robed hall monitor for grown-ups, dedicated to stamping out any unauthorized fun. One can only imagine the passive-aggressive glares if a circator found someone, say, idly doodling in the margins of a sacred text. The air is cold, carrying the scent of damp stone, ancient wood, beeswax, and a faint, almost metallic tang you can't quite place. There's also, occasionally, a whiff of incense from the chapel, a ghostly reminder of the prayerful duties that frame the day. Life here is stripped bare, reduced to essentials: God, work, and community. It's a far cry from the life you know, a stark reminder of the sheer discipline and fortitude required not just to survive, but to build and maintain such a society in an age of constant peril and hardship. You wonder if they ever get a day off, or if Holy Day just means an extra prayer service. The pace is slow, deliberate, but relentless. There's no room for personal whims, no space for spontaneity. Every action is prescribed, every hour accounted for. It is, in its own way, a perfectly ordered machine, chugging along through the centuries, powered by faith and an astonishing amount of routine. And somewhere within this highly structured, deeply spiritual, and undeniably chilly environment, they found the time and the sanction to brew beer. That's a testament to priorities, if ever there was one. Brother Thomas finally leads you into a slightly less frigid part of the monastery. It's not exactly a sauna, mind you. You're not about to start peeling off layers and asking for a chilled towel. But the edge has been taken off the cold. Perhaps it's closer to the kitchens. Or maybe there's a brazier burning somewhere nearby, though you don't see one immediately. He gestures for you to sit on a rough wooden bench, and then, with the same eloquent silence, he departs, leaving you to thaw out your extremities and ponder your next move, which mostly involves not freezing solid again. As you rub your hands together, trying to coax some life back into your fingers, you start to think about the basics of survival. And one of the most fundamental is hydration. Water. Simple, life-giving water. Except, in the medieval world, simple, life-giving water was often anything but. You try to imagine the water sources available to most people, and indeed to many monasteries, especially those not blessed with a pristine mountain spring bubbling up right in their cloister garth. You'd have rivers, certainly, but these were often the dumping grounds for all manner of waste. Think about it. No modern sanitation systems, no sewage treatment plants. Towns and villages situated upstream would be casually discarding everything from human and animal waste to tannery runoff and the byproducts of any number of unpleasant, smelly industries directly into the water that people downstream were then expected to drink. It's a recipe for disaster, a veritable soup of potential pathogens. Not exactly the refreshing Evian experience we're used to. You probably wouldn't want to fill your fancy reusable water bottle from the medieval Thames, let's put it that way. Then there were wells, better, perhaps, but still susceptible to contamination. A poorly sited well could easily be infiltrated by seepage from nearby latrines or graveyards. And even if the well was clean initially, the methods of drawing water, often a communal, bucket and rope, could introduce contaminants. One person with unwashed hands, or a bucket that had been used for something less salubrious, could taint the entire supply. It's a grim thought, but diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid fever were rampant, often spread through contaminated water. A simple drink could quite literally kill you. Historians frequently point to the high infant and child mortality rates in the medieval period as being significantly linked to waterborne illnesses. Those little immune systems just couldn't cope. Even rainwater collected in cisterns wasn't always safe. It could be contaminated by bird droppings on the roofs it ran off, or by whatever dust and pollutants were in the air. And medieval air, especially in urban areas or near industries like mining or smelting, wasn't always the pristine countryside breeze we might romanticize. So, you're faced with a dilemma. You need to drink to live, but drinking the available water could make you very, very ill, or worse. It's like playing Russian roulette with your digestive system. Every sip is a gamble. This inherent risk in drinking water is precisely where ale and later beer steps into the limelight. The process of brewing, even in its most rudimentary medieval forms, involved boiling the water. This boiling, often for a significant period, had the very convenient side effect of killing most of the harmful bacteria and pathogens lurking within. The monks, and indeed the general populace, might not have understood the germ theory of disease. Louis Pasteur and his fancy microscopes were centuries away, but they absolutely understood cause and effect. They knew, through generations of observation and painful experience, that people who drank ale tended to be healthier, or at least less prone to sudden unpleasant intestinal distress, than those who relied solely on untreated water. It was empirical evidence at its most convincing. Drink this, get sick. Drink that, feel fine. The choice becomes pretty clear, especially if you're fond of not spending your days regretting your last beverage. So, ale wasn't just a pleasant tipple, a way to unwind after a long day of, well, more prayer and work. It was, in many respects, a safer, more reliable source of hydration than water. It provided fluids, yes, but fluids that had been inadvertently pasteurized. This made it an incredibly important staple in the medieval diet, consumed by people of all ages and social classes, from peasants to kings, and, most relevant to our current chilly situation, by monks. Some monasteries even had dedicated infirmary, ales, weaker brews perhaps, specifically for the sick, because it was recognized as a wholesome and relatively safe drink. You can imagine the relief, the near certainty that came with pouring a mug of ale. It wasn't just about the taste or the gentle warmth it might impart. It was about the implicit trust that this beverage wouldn't betray you from the inside out. This fundamental unsafeness of water is a key reason why brewing became so widespread and so vital. It wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. One quirky tidbit often mentioned is that even children would drink small ale, a very weak, low-alcohol brew, because it was still considered safer than water. Modern sensibilities might balk at the idea of giving kids beer, but in a world where the alternative could be a fatal illness, the perspective shifts dramatically. It's like choosing the lesser of two evils, where one evil is slightly tipsy toddlers, and the other is a dysentery epidemic. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for widespread ale consumption was its safety profile or simply its caloric and nutritional value, especially for the working poor. It was likely a combination of both, a happy convergence of benefits, but the safety aspect cannot be overstated. In a world rife with invisible dangers, ale offered a small measure of security, a predictable goodness, and for the monks, dedicated to a life of order and spiritual purity, ensuring the physical well-being of their community through safe drink would have been a practical extension of their pastoral care. They were, after all, shepherds of their flock, and keeping that flock healthy was paramount, even if it meant becoming experts in the art of making a good, safe pint. The rise of ale is inextricably linked to the fallibility of water. One quenched thirst, the other, too often, quenched life. And in the cold stone heart of a monastery, that ale would soon become a very welcome friend indeed. So, you're sitting there, pondering the perils of medieval plumbing, or lack thereof, and appreciating the genius of accidentally sterilized beverages. The idea that these deeply religious men, sworn to lives of piety, poverty, in theory anyway, and obedience, were also enthusiastic brewers might seem a little incongruous at first glance. Doesn't chugging ale clash a bit with chanting psalms and contemplating the divine? You might picture monks as perpetually solemn figures, subsisting on bread, water, and spiritual enlightenment. And water, as we've established, was a bit of a gamble. Bread and enlightenment are great, but a fellow needs his fluids. This is where the surprisingly pragmatic nature of St. Benedict and his famous rule comes into play. Remember St. Benedict, the one who wrote the monastic instruction manual back in the 6th century. Well, he wasn't entirely against a little tipple. Chapter 40 of the Rule of St. Benedict is dedicated to the measure of drink. It's a fascinating little section, a real insight into the practicalities of communal living and, dare we say, a touch of early HR management. Benedict, ever the realist, acknowledged that, ideally, monks should probably abstain from wine altogether. He starts by quoting scripture, noting that Wine maketh even the wise to fall away. Solid advice, very on brand for a saintly founder. You can almost hear him sighing as he dictates this part, knowing what's coming next. But then, in a brilliant display of understanding human nature, or perhaps just the grumbling he'd get if he enforced total prohibition, he adds a crucial caveat. He writes, "Nevertheless, because in our times monks cannot be persuaded of this, let us at least agree to this, that we do not drink to satiety, but sparingly." It's a masterful compromise. He's essentially saying, look, I know you guys. I know you're not going to go for the whole no booze thing, so let's at least not get hammered. This recognition that absolute asceticism might be counterproductive for the average monk was key to the rule's enduring success. He understood that a small comfort, reasonably enjoyed, could actually support the demanding life of prayer and labor, rather than detract from it. Trying to enforce a rule that was widely ignored would just undermine the whole system. Better to allow a little and regulate it. The rule then goes on to specify a hemina of wine per monk per day. Now, the exact volume of a hemina is one of those things that food historians and classicists love to debate endlessly. Estimates vary, but it's generally thought to be somewhere around half a pint to a pint. Not a massive amount, certainly. Not enough to fuel a wild monastic party, but a decent, recognized daily allowance. Crucially, Benedict adds that if local conditions, heavy labor, or the heat of summer required more, the superior of the monastery had the discretion to increase the allowance, provided always that satiety or drunkenness be avoided. This flexibility was vital. Monks engaged in strenuous agricultural work in the blazing sun would need more fluids and calories than those doing light manuscript work in a cool scriptorium. It's a surprisingly modern approach to workplace well-being, really. Stay hydrated, folks, but don't overdo it. Now you might be thinking, wine? But this is about beer. And you're right. The rule of Saint Benedict originated in Italy, a wine-drinking culture. However, as Benedictine monasticism spread northwards into regions like Germany, Gaul, France, and the British Isles, they entered lands where grapes didn't flourish as readily, but grains like barley and wheat certainly did. These northern European cultures had their own long-standing traditions of brewing and drinking ale. So, the pragmatic monks, ever adaptable, simply interpreted wine in the rule to include their local fermented beverage of choice, ale. If the spirit of the rule was to provide a safe, moderate daily drink, then ale fit the bill perfectly in places where wine was scarce or prohibitively expensive. This substitution is a classic example of how the Benedictine rule, while specific in some areas, was broad enough in principle to be adapted to diverse geographical and cultural contexts. So, the rule didn't just permit ale, it practically endorsed it as a daily staple, a provision for the monk's well-being. This sacred sanction elevated brewing from a mere domestic chore to an integral part of monastic life, a necessary craft to support the community. The monastery brewhouse became as essential as the bakery or the scriptorium. This wasn't some cheeky workaround, some monks secretly brewing in the basement. It was an officially sanctioned, regulated, and necessary part of their self-sufficient existence. And because monks were often among the most literate and meticulous record-keepers of their time, they approached brewing with the same diligence and attention to detail they applied to copying sacred texts or managing their estates. This, as we'll see, would have a profound impact on the development and refinement of brewing techniques. One slightly quirky fringe theory you sometimes hear is that certain monasteries developed specific brews not just for general consumption, but also for particular feast days, with the richness or strength of the beer subtly reflecting the importance of the saint or festival being celebrated. Imagine a St. Michael's Mighty Ale versus a more modest St. Swithin's Session Brew. While concrete proof for such a nuanced liturgical beer calendar is scarce for the early medieval period, it's a charming idea, suggesting a deeper integration of brewing into the very rhythm of monastic celebration. What is well documented is that guest houses, like the one you're currently warming up in, slowly, were also provisioned with ale for visitors. Hospitality was a cornerstone of the Benedictine rule. Let all guests who arrive be received like Christ. And offering a weary traveller a safe, nourishing drink was a fundamental act of Christian charity. Given the state you arrived in, you're particularly grateful for this aspect of their holy mandate. The permission granted by the rule, therefore, wasn't just a loophole. It was a foundational element that allowed brewing to thrive within monastery walls. It transformed beer from a potentially worldly indulgence into a blessed provision, a gift from God to sustain his servants. Without Saint Benedict's understanding nod to the realities of monastic life and the need for a little liquid bread, the story of monastic brewing, and indeed the history of beer itself, might have taken a very different and much drier path. You can almost hear the collective sigh of relief from centuries of monks. Thank Benedict for the beer clause. It meant that even in the depths of a harsh winter, a warming, nourishing pint was not just a dream, but a divinely approved reality. Right, so the monks have the saintly go-ahead for a daily pint, which is excellent news for them, and frankly, for you, as the prospect of something warm and nourishing is becoming increasingly appealing. But you can't just magic beer into existence with prayer and good intentions alone, though they probably tried that too at some point. Oh, divine fermenter, turn this water into ale. Probably didn't work as well as they hoped. No, brewing is a craft, an art even, and like any good recipe, it starts with the ingredients, and the absolute, undisputed heavyweight champion ingredient for medieval ale, the very soul of the brew, was grain, specifically barley. Imagine the landscape around the monastery, not as it is now, a vast frozen white desert, but in the warmer months. Picture fields stretching out, rippling gold under a summer sun. These weren't just pretty views for the monks to contemplate during their walking meditations. These fields were their lifeblood, their pantry, their brewery supply, store, while monasteries grew various crops: wheat for bread, oats for animal feed or porridge, perhaps rye in some regions. Barley held a special place due to its remarkable suitability for brewing. It was the king of the brewing grains. Why barley? Well, it has a few natural advantages that made it the brewer's darling. Firstly, it's a hardy crop. It can grow in a wider range of climates and soil types than, say, wheat. This made it a reliable staple, even in less fertile areas where monasteries were often established. Remember, these guys weren't picking prime real estate next to the medieval equivalent of a Whole Foods. They were often in the middle of nowhere, taming the wilderness. A tough, adaptable grain was a godsend. Secondly, and crucially for brewing, barley grains are encased in a husk. This husk, while inedible, plays a vital role later in the brewing process, acting as a natural filter bed when they're trying to separate the sweet liquid from the mashed grains. It's like Mother Nature included a built-in brewing tool. Clever, eh? But the real magic of barley lies in its starch content, and importantly, its potential to produce the enzymes needed to convert those starches into fermentable sugars. This is the absolute heart of making beer. You need sugar for the yeast to eat, and yeast-eating sugar is what gives you alcohol and carbonation. Raw barley grain is mostly starch, which yeast can't do much with. It's like giving a baby a whole, uncooked potato and expecting them to make chips. The starches need to be broken down into simpler sugars, and barley, when treated correctly through a process called malting, which we'll get to, conveniently produces the very enzymes that do this job. It's a self-contained conversion kit. So, the monastic calendar would have revolved heavily around the agricultural cycle of their barley crop. Ploughing in the spring, often with heavy ox-drawn ploughs, a scene of immense toil, sowing the seed, with prayers for a good harvest, because crop failure meant not just less bread, but potentially less ale, a truly grim prospect. Then came the long wait through summer, tending the fields, weeding and keeping an anxious eye on the weather. Too much rain, too little rain, unseasonable frosts, all could devastate the precious crop. You can bet there were a lot of prayers specifically directed towards bountiful barley harvests. Please, Lord, let the barley be plentiful, for thy servants are thirsty. Harvest time, in late summer or early autumn, would have been a period of intense activity for the entire monastic community. Everyone who could be spared from other essential duties would be out in the fields, scythes flashing, reaping the golden stalks. It was back-breaking work under a hot sun, but driven by the knowledge that this was their provision for the long winter ahead. The harvested barley would then be threshed, beaten to separate the grains from the stalks, and winnowed, tossed, into the air so the wind could carry away the lighter chaff, leaving the heavier grains behind. It's a process you've seen in historical paintings, that iconic image of agricultural life. The gathered grain, the monastery's golden treasure, then needed to be stored. This was a critical step. Damp grain would quickly spoil, becoming mouldy and unusable. So, monasteries had granaries, often substantial stone buildings, designed to keep the grain dry and safe from vermin. A well-stocked granary was a symbol of security, a bulwark against hunger and, importantly, thirst. Historians still argue whether the large fortified granaries found at some monastic sites were primarily for storing the monastery's own bumper harvests, or if they also functioned as commercial storehouses, part of the monastery's economic activities in the wider region. Given their landholdings and influence, it was likely a bit of both. While barley was the star, other grains were sometimes used in brewing, either out of necessity or for variety. Wheat could be used, producing a different character in the ale, sometimes lighter in body or with a slightly different flavour profile. Oats were also occasionally added, potentially contributing a smoothness or silkiness to the brew. Spelt, an ancient type of wheat, is also mentioned in some historical brewing records. However, these were generally supporting actors. Barley, with its perfect package of starches, enzymes, and that handy husk, remained the lead performer. One quirky tidbit is the concept of bear or bigger, ancient forms of 6-row barley that were particularly hardy and common in Scotland and Scandinavia. These tough little grains allowed brewing to flourish even in very challenging northern climates, a testament to barley's adaptability. So, as you sit on that bench, gradually regaining feeling in your toes, picture those fields, that golden bounty. It all starts there. Without those dedicated monks toiling under the sun, without that careful cultivation and harvesting, there would be no liquid loaf to sustain them through the winter. The journey from a tiny seed planted in the cold earth to a warming mug of ale is a long and laborious one, deeply intertwined with the rhythms of nature and the unceasing work of the monastic community. The fields of gold weren't just picturesque, they were the very foundation of survival, sustenance, and yes, a little bit of regulated, rule-sanctioned cheer. The quality of their ale, and therefore a significant part of their winter comfort, depended entirely on the bounty of those barley fields. No barley, no beer. A sobering thought indeed, especially in a medieval winter. All right, so the monastery granary is bulging with beautiful plump barley corns, safe and dry, patiently waiting for their destiny. But, as we've touched upon, raw barley isn't quite ready to become beer. It's like having a pile of wood and expecting it to magically turn into a cozy fire. There's a crucial transformation needed first, a process that unlocks the grain's hidden potential. This is the art of malting, and it's where the real alchemy begins, turning humble barley into the sweet soul of the ale. If barley is the body, malt is the spirit. Imagine you're one of the monks tasked with this vital job. It's not glamorous work, not like illuminating manuscripts with gold leaf or chanting complex plainsong. Malting is earthy, a bit damp, and requires patience and a keen eye. But it's absolutely essential. The first step is steeping. You take a carefully measured quantity of that precious barley from the granary and immerse it in water. Large wooden tubs or stone troughs would have been used for this. The goal here is to awaken the dormant barley corn, to trick it into thinking it's springtime and time to grow. The grain soaks up the water, swelling in size, its moisture content steadily increasing. This steeping process might last for a couple of days, with the water changed periodically to keep it fresh and prevent unwanted microbial growth. You're essentially giving the barley a nice long bath, a spa day before its big performance. Once the barley has absorbed enough water, the experienced maltster would know by feel and appearance when it's ready, perhaps looking for a little chit or tiny rootlet beginning to emerge. It's drained and spread out on the floor of the malt house. This is the germination phase. The malt house floor, often made of stone or tile, needed to be cool and clean. Here, the barley is laid out in a relatively thin layer, and for the next several days, it's carefully tended. It needs to be kept moist, but not wet, and at the right temperature to encourage germination. This is where the magic really happens internally. As the barley corn begins to sprout, it produces enzymes. These are the biological catalysts, the tiny workers that will later break down the complex starches within the grain into simpler, fermentable sugars. The two main enzyme groups brewers get excited about are amylases, specifically alpha amylase and beta amylase. Think of them as microscopic scissors, ready to snip those long starch chains into bite-sized sugary pieces for the yeast. During germination, the maltster monk would be constantly turning the grain. This was done with large wooden shovels or rakes. Turning served several purposes. It prevented the tiny rootlets from matting together into an unmanageable green carpet. It helped to aerate the grain, and crucially, it helped to control the temperature. Germination produces heat, and if the grain bed got too warm, it could kill off those vital enzymes or encourage the growth of undesirable molds. So, it was a delicate balancing act. Enough warmth to encourage growth, but not so much as to spoil the process. You can imagine the rhythmic scrape of shovel on stone, the slightly sweet, earthy smell of sprouting grain filling the malt house. It's a physically demanding job, all that turning, especially with large batches. No wonder St. Benedict allowed for a bit more ale for those doing heavy labour. The maltster watches the sprouting grains with an expert eye. He's looking for the acrospire, the nascent shoot or sprout, to grow to a certain length underneath. The husk, ideally about 3/4 to the full length of the grain. If it grows out too much, it consumes too much of the starch reserves. If it doesn't grow enough, enzyme development will be insufficient. It's a precise art, learned through experience and passed down from one monastic maltster to the next. Historians still argue whether medieval maltsters relied purely on visual cues and empirical knowledge, or if they had more sophisticated, though unrecorded, methods for judging the perfect point to halt germination. Given their generally meticulous nature, it's likely a combination of deep traditional knowledge and careful observation. Once the maltster judges that the enzyme development is optimal and the acrospire has reached the desired length, it's time to stop the germination process. This is done by drying the sprouted grain, now officially called green malt, and this is where the kiln comes in. The green malt is transferred to a kiln, where it's dried with heat. Early medieval kilns were often rudimentary affairs, perhaps a perforated floor above a gentle fire. The type of fuel used for kilning could have a significant impact on the flavour of the final malt, and thus the beer. Wood was common, but if it was a smoky wood, it could impart a smoky character to the malt. Think of it as an accidental Rauchbier. Peat was used in some regions, famously giving Scotch whisky its characteristic smoky phenolic notes, and it could do the same for beer if used to dry the malt. Cleaner burning fuels, like charcoal or later, coke, would produce a paler malt with less smoky flavour. The temperature and duration of kilning were also critical. A lower, slower drying process would preserve more of the enzymes and result in a paler, more enzyme-rich malt, often called pale malt. This would be good for efficient sugar conversion. If the malt was kilned at higher temperatures, or for longer, it would develop darker colours and more complex roasted, nutty, or even chocolatey flavours. These darker malts, like brown malt or amber malt, would have fewer active enzymes, but would contribute significantly to the colour and flavour profile of the beer. The monks, through trial and error, would have learned to produce different types of malt for different styles of ale. You can imagine a monk, his face lit by the glow of the kiln fire, carefully monitoring the drying malt, the aroma of toasting, grain filling the air. It's a sensory job, the look, the feel, the smell of the malt, all providing clues to its readiness. A quirky and slightly alarming tidbit is that early kilns weren't always perfectly designed, and there was a genuine fire risk. A malt house fire could be catastrophic, destroying not just the precious malt, but potentially the entire brewery or even adjacent monastic buildings. Also, inconsistent kilning could lead to something called slack malt, malt that hadn't been dried sufficiently and was prone to spoilage or producing off flavors. So the maltster wasn't just a grain sprouter, he was a guardian against disaster. Once kilned, the malt is stable and can be stored for months until needed for brewing. The tiny dried rootlets, now brittle, are usually screened off, as they can contribute undesirable flavors. What's left is the finished malt, crisp, fragrant, and packed with the potential to create wonderful ale. This whole process, from raw barley to finished malt, might take a week or more. It's a testament to the monks' dedication and their understanding of natural processes. They weren't just following a recipe, they were coaxing life from dormant seeds, harnessing biological power, and transforming a simple grain into something truly special. The quality of their ale depended hugely on the quality of their malt. A good maltster was worth his weight in, well, malt. And as you sit there, finally feeling a bit of warmth seep back into your bones, you can appreciate that the journey to that anticipated pint involves far more than just boiling some grain. It involves this intricate, patient dance of sprouting, seeds, the very soul of the beer being carefully cultivated within those ancient stone walls. The carefully prepared malt, that beautiful, crisp, enzyme-rich product of the malt house, is now ready for the next stage of its journey to becoming ale. It's time for the mash. This is where all that patient work of malting pays off, where the starch is so diligently preserved and the enzymes so carefully cultivated get to do their thing. If malting was about awakening potential, mashing is about realizing it. You're moving from the earthy domain of the maltster to the steamy, sweet-smelling realm of the brewer-monk. First, the malt needs to be crushed or milled. You can't just throw whole malt kernels into hot water and expect miracles. The hard outer husk needs to be broken open to expose the starchy endosperm inside, making it accessible to the hot water and the enzymes. However, you don't want to pulverize it into fine flour. Remember that handy husk we talked about earlier, the one that barley brought to the party? That needs to be kept relatively intact because it will form that crucial filter bed later on. So, the milling process was a bit of a balancing act. Medieval monks would have likely used a simple stone quern or a small grist mill, perhaps powered by hand, by donkey, or if the monastery was particularly well equipped and situated near a stream, by a water wheel. You can imagine the rhythmic grinding sound, the satisfying crunch as the malt kernels are cracked open, releasing a wonderfully sweet, grainy aroma. It's the perfume of incipient beer. Once the malt is appropriately crushed, now called grist, it's mixed with hot water in a vessel called a mash tun. Mash tuns would have been large wooden vats, or perhaps copper vessels, in wealthier or later period monasteries. And the temperature of this water, the strike water, is absolutely critical. This is where the brewer's skill really shines. The enzymes that convert starch to sugar are like fussy little workers. They have optimal temperature ranges in which they perform best. Too cold, and they're sluggish and inefficient. Too hot, and they can be denatured, essentially cooked, and rendered useless. It's like trying to get your computer to work by either putting it in the freezer or baking it in the oven. Neither ends well. The primary enzymes at play here are beta amylase and alpha amylase. Beta amylase typically works best at slightly lower temperatures, say around 60-65 degrees Celsius, 140-149 Fahrenheit. It nibbles away at the ends of starch chains, producing a sugar called maltose, which is highly fermentable by yeast. Alpha amylase prefers slightly higher temperatures, perhaps 70–75 degrees Celsius, 158–167 Fahrenheit. It's less precise, randomly chopping up long starch chains into shorter, less fermentable sugars called dextrins, as well as some fermentable sugars. Dextrins contribute to the body, mouthfeel, and head retention of the finished beer. So, the medieval brewer, without a precise thermometer, those were a much later invention, would have relied on experience, rules of thumb, and perhaps some clever natural indicators to get the water temperature right. They might have used the rule of thumb, literally, testing the water temperature with a finger, ouch, or by observing how quickly a certain amount of cold water cooled a boiling kettle, or by mixing boiling water and cold water in known proportions. Historians still argue whether medieval brewers employed a single temperature infusion mash, where the grist is mixed with water at a specific target temperature and held there, or if they used more complex step mashing techniques, raising the temperature of the mash through different rests to optimize the activity of different enzymes. Given the sophistication monks brought to other crafts, it's plausible they developed intuitive step mashing methods over time. Once the grist and hot water are combined in the mash tun, the mixture, now called the mash, is stirred thoroughly to ensure an even temperature and good contact between the water and the crushed malt. Then, it's left to rest for an hour or so. During this resting period, the enzymes get to work, diligently converting the starches into sugars. The mash tun would likely be covered to retain heat. You can imagine the brewer-monk occasionally lifting the lid, peering into the steamy interior, the air thick with a sweet, porridge-like aroma. It's a quiet, almost magical transformation taking place. The solid starches are liquefying into a sugary solution. After the rest, it's time to separate the sweet liquid, now called wort, pronounced wort, from the spent grains. This is where that barley husk comes into its own. The mash tun would typically have a false bottom or a system of taps and strainers. The husks from the crushed malt settle to form a natural filter bed. The brewer then slowly drains the wort. From the bottom of the mash tun, a process called lautering. The first runnings of wort are often very rich and sugary. It's a beautiful, amber-coloured liquid, fragrant and intensely sweet. You could probably make a pretty decent medieval energy drink out of it. Often, the brewer wouldn't just take these first runnings. To extract as much sugar as possible, a process called sparging would be employed. This involves sprinkling more hot water over the top of the grain bed to rinse through any remaining sugars. These later runnings would be weaker, less sugary. The monks might collect these different runnings separately. The rich first wort could be used for their stronger ales, the abbot's special perhaps, while the second or even third runnings, known as small beers or table beers, would produce a weaker, everyday ale for general consumption by the monks, or for giving to servants or the poor. This was an economical way to get the most out of their precious malt. It's like making a strong cup of tea and then using the same tea bag to make a couple of weaker cups. Waste not, want not, especially in a monastery. One quirky tidbit regarding mashing. Some historical accounts mention the use of heated stones, dropped directly into the mash tun, as a way to raise the temperature of the mash, especially if the initial strike water was too cool, or if they were attempting a rudimentary form of step mashing. This method, known as Steinbier, stone beer, in some traditions, could also lead to some caramelization of the wort, where it contacted the hot stones, adding unique flavors. Imagine the hiss and steam as red-hot rocks are plunged into the sweet, grainy liquid. It sounds a bit hazardous, frankly. You'd want to stand well back. The resulting wort, this sweet, unfermented beer-to-be, is the prize. It's the sugary food source that the yeast will soon feast upon. The quality of the mashing process, getting the temperatures right, achieving good conversion, efficient lautering, directly impacts the strength and character of the final ale. It's a crucial step, transforming the solid promise of the malt into liquid potential. You can almost taste the sweetness in the air, a comforting, nourishing aroma that speaks of sustenance and the craft of generations. This warm, sugary liquid is the heart of the brew, created through a careful understanding of natural processes, a testament to the monks' ingenuity and their ability to turn simple grain and water into something truly special, something to look forward to in the long, cold days and nights. So you have this beautiful, sweet, amber liquid, the wort, patiently waiting in a large brewing kettle, probably made of copper if the monastery was well off, or perhaps a large iron cauldron. It smells delicious, like a warm liquid biscuit, but it's not beer yet, not by a long shot. The next crucial stage in its transformation is the boil. This isn't just about heating it up for fun. The boil serves several vital purposes, and it's also the point at which a truly revolutionary ingredient makes its grand entrance, at least in many monastic breweries, changing the beer game forever: hops. First, let's talk about why you boil. The what? One of the most important reasons, as we've already discussed in the context of unsafe water, is sterilization. Even though the water used for mashing was hot, the boil takes it a step further. Boiling the wort for a good hour or even longer kills off any lingering wild yeasts, bacteria, or other unwelcome microorganisms that might have come along for the ride from the malt, the air, or the equipment. You want your chosen yeast, or the local wild yeast you're hoping for, to be the star of the show during fermentation, not some random bug that's going to produce off flavors or spoil the batch. So, the boil is like hitting the reset button, creating a clean slate for fermentation. It's the bouncer at the door of the fermentation party, making sure only the invited guests get in. The boil also serves to concentrate the wort. As water evaporates, the sugars become more concentrated, which can lead to a stronger, more flavorful beer. It also helps to drive off certain volatile compounds that you don't want in your finished product, things that might contribute undesirable aromas like dimethyl sulfide, DMS, which can give beer a cooked corn or cabbage-like smell, not exactly the aroma profile you're aiming for in your Abbott's Delight. Furthermore, the heat of the boil causes proteins from the malt to coagulate and clump together, a process called the hot break. These proteins, if left in the beer, can lead to haze and instability later on. During the boil, they form visible particles that will eventually settle out, leading to a clearer final product. You can imagine the brewer monk skimming these proteins off the surface of the boiling wort with a large ladle or sieve. It's like making a good stock. You always skim the impurities. But the really big news, the headline act of the boil, especially as medieval brewing techniques evolved, was the addition of hops. For centuries prior to the widespread adoption of hops, ales were often bittered and flavored with a mixture of herbs and spices known as gruit or grut. This gruit mixture could contain all sorts of things: bog myrtle, yarrow, heather, horehound, juniper berries, ginger, aniseed. The recipes were often closely guarded secrets, and in some regions, the right to sell gruit was a valuable monopoly controlled by local lords or even the church. Gruit ales would have had a very different character from modern beers, often sweeter, perhaps with spicy, herbal, or even medicinal notes. Think less crisp and refreshing IPA, and more interesting herbal health tonic. Hops, the cone-like flowers of the Humulus lupulus plant, brought several fantastic advantages to the brewing world. Their most celebrated contribution is bitterness. Hops contain alpha acids, which, when boiled, isomerize and become soluble, imparting a clean, balancing bitterness to the sweet wort. This bitterness was a game changer, providing a counterpoint to the malt sweetness and making the beer much more palatable and refreshing. Suddenly, you had a more complex flavor profile, a tug-of-war between sweet and bitter that made the drink far more interesting. Beyond bitterness, hops also contribute aroma and flavor. Different hop varieties, and when they are added to the boil, can impart a wide range of characteristics: floral, citrusy, earthy, spicy, piney. Early medieval brewers might not have had the vast selection of aroma hops we have today, but they certainly would have recognized the pleasant aromatics that hops brought to the brew. Perhaps most importantly, though, hops act as a preservative. The hop resins have antimicrobial properties that inhibit the growth of spoilage bacteria, meaning that hopped beer lasted longer and was less prone to turning sour than Groot ales. This was a huge advantage, especially for monasteries that might be brewing larger batches to last through the winter or for distribution to guests and the needy. A beer that stays fresh longer is a much more reliable and valuable commodity. Remember how quickly things could spoil in the medieval period. Hops were like a little insurance policy for your beer. The adoption of hops wasn't an overnight revolution everywhere. It was a gradual process, spreading from continental Europe, particularly Germany, where hop cultivation was documented as early as the 8th and 9th centuries in monastic gardens, like those of St. Denis in Paris or Corvey in Westphalia, into other brewing regions. England, for example, was famously a bit late to the hop party, with some drinkers initially viewing hopped beer with suspicion, considering it an adulteration of their traditional unhopped ale. There were even periods where hops were banned or taxed heavily. One quirky tidbit is that some English traditionalists would derisively call hopped beer beer, as distinct from their beloved ale, which was unhopped. Over time, however, the manifest advantages of hops, better flavour, better preservation, won out. Historians still argue about the exact timeline and extent of hop usage in monastic breweries across different parts of Europe during the early to high medieval period. Some monastic orders, like the Cistercians with their emphasis on agricultural innovation, may have been earlier adopters and experimenters with hop cultivation and usage. You can imagine the monks carefully tending their hop vines in the monastery garden, a new and exciting crop. So, back in your imaginary brewhouse, the wort is at a rolling boil. At some point, the brewer monk, with a knowing look, reaches for a sack of dried hop cones. He'll add some early in the boil for bitterness. The longer they boil, the more bitterness is extracted. He might add another portion later in the boil for flavour and perhaps a final addition right at the end, or even after the boil as the wort cools, a technique we now call whirlpool or steeped hops, to capture those delicate hop aromas. The brewhouse would fill with a new, pungent, wonderfully resinous and aromatic scent, mingling with the sweet smell of the malt. It's the smell of modern beer being born. This bubbling, fragrant cauldron is a far cry from just boiled grain, water. It's a complex, carefully crafted infusion, soon to be transformed by the final magic of yeast. The decision to boil, and especially the decision to add hops, marked a massive leap forward in the quality, stability, and deliciousness of the brew they were so diligently preparing to survive those long, cold winters. The boil is complete. The brewhouse is filled with the rich, complex aroma of sweet malt and pungent hops, a truly inviting perfume that speaks of good things to come. The brewer monk has skillfully skimmed off the hop break, those unwanted proteins, and the wort, now sterilized and bittered, is a clear, vibrant liquid, hopefully teeming with potential. But before the next magical step can occur, there's a critical and somewhat tricky hurdle to overcome: cooling the wort, and cooling it quickly. You can't just pitch yeast into boiling hot wort. Yeast, those tiny little miracle workers, are living organisms, and like most living organisms, they don't appreciate being scalded. Introduce them to wort that's too hot, and they'll die a swift, unceremonious death, and your beer will be, well, just hot, sweet, hoppy water, a tragic waste of all that good work. The wort needs to be brought down to a temperature suitable for fermentation, typically somewhere in the range of 18-22 degrees Celsius, around 64-72 Fahrenheit, for ale yeasts, though this could vary, cooling a large volume of very hot liquid quickly in an era before refrigeration was a significant challenge, and speed was important. The longer the wort remained warm and unfermented, the more susceptible it was to infection by stray wild yeasts or bacteria that might have survived the initial boil or are floating around in the air. Remember, the medieval brewery wasn't a sterile laboratory. Contamination was an ever-present threat, the unseen enemy of good beer. So, a slow cooling process was an open invitation for these microscopic party crashers to jump in and spoil the batch, leading to sour, off-flavored, or undrinkable ale. Not the kind of thing you want to be sipping during a blizzard. So, How did our medieval monks tackle this? They had a few methods, depending on their resources and the scale of their brewing operation. For smaller batches, they might simply leave the kettle in a cool place, perhaps in a cellar or a drafty outbuilding, and let ambient temperature do the work. But this was slow and risky. A more active approach involved transferring the hot wort into wide, shallow vessels called coolships, or in French, coolships. These were often large, open-topped wooden or sometimes copper pans, designed to maximize the surface area of the wort exposed to the air. This increased surface area would allow heat to dissipate more rapidly. Coolships were typically housed in a specific part of the brewery, often a room with louved vents or windows that could be opened to allow cool air to circulate over the wort. You can picture the steam billowing off the surface of the wort in the coolship room, the monks perhaps using large flat paddles to gently agitate the liquid, further aiding the cooling process. The use of coolships also had another rather fascinating, and at the time, entirely mysterious side effect. As the wort lay there, open to the air, it wasn't just cooling, it was also being inoculated, not by the brewer intentionally adding yeast, but by wild yeasts and other microorganisms present in the brewery environment, floating in on the air currents, settling onto the surface of the wort. This was particularly true for traditional Belgian, lambic brewing, which still relies on spontaneous fermentation via coolships today. For many medieval brewers, this spontaneous inoculation was simply how fermentation started. They knew that if they left the cooled wort out, it would, after a day or two, begin to bubble and froth. They didn't understand the microbiology, the yeast cells themselves, but they understood the process. It was seen as a gift, a mystery, a divine intervention even, that turned sweet wort into strong ale. Of course, relying on whatever microbes happened to be drifting by was a bit of a gamble. Sometimes you'd get a wonderful, complex fermentation. Other times, you might get something less desirable. The specific microflora of a particular brewery, the unique blend of yeasts and bacteria living in the wooden beams, the stone walls, even in the brewing vessels themselves, would contribute to the unique character of that monastery's beer. This is why beers from different abbeys, even if following similar recipes, could taste remarkably different. It was the original terroir of beer, long before the wine folks claimed the term. Historians still argue about the extent to which medieval brewers understood or tried to manage this house character. Did they, for example, know that wort cooled in a certain part of the brewery tended to produce better results? It's highly likely they did, through generations of trial, error, and careful observation. Another method for cooling, if the monastery was blessed with a cold running stream or a deep well, was to use a rudimentary form of heat exchanger. They might place the kettle of hot wort or smaller vessels filled with wort into the cold water, allowing the heat to transfer. Some more sophisticated setups might have involved flowing cold water around the outside of the wort container. These methods would have been more efficient and quicker than relying solely on air cooling, and also reduce the exposure time to airborne contaminants. Once the wort reached the desired temperature, and again, judging this without a thermometer, relied on experience, perhaps by feel, or by observing how quickly steam stopped rising. It was time for the main event, fermentation. If the monks weren't relying on spontaneous inoculation from the coolship, they would add yeast. But where did they get this yeast? In the early medieval period, they didn't have neatly packaged sachets of dried yeast or pure liquid cultures from a lab. Often, they would re-pitch yeast from a previous successful batch. At the end of fermentation, a thick, frothy sediment of yeast, known as balm or God is good, literally God is good, a testament to its perceived miraculous properties, would be collected from the top or bottom of the fermentation vessel. A portion of this precious balm would be carefully saved and added to the next batch of cooled wort. This practice of continuous repitching not only propagated the yeast, but also, over time, led to the selection of yeast strains that were particularly well suited to that specific brewery's conditions and the type of ale they were making. It was an early, unintentional form of yeast domestication. One quirky tidbit. Sometimes the balm was so valued that it was even used in baking to leaven bread, giving rise to the term liquid bread for beer in a very literal sense. The yeast, full of B vitamins and protein, was a nutritious byproduct. Some monasteries even had balm wives whose specific job was to manage and preserve this vital fermenting agent. So, the cooled wort is finally ready. The brewer monk, perhaps with a quiet prayer or a hopeful glance upwards, introduces the balm. The yeast, those tiny unseen engines of transformation, are pitched into their sugary feast. The wort is then transferred to fermentation vessels, often large wooden tuns or casks, which would be housed in a cool, dark part of the monastery, perhaps a cellar. And then they wait. They wait for the mystic froth, for the visible, signs that the ancient, invisible magic of fermentation has begun. A magic they facilitated but didn't fully understand. A magic that would turn their sweet, hoppy liquid into the warming, nourishing ale they so desperately needed to face the long, dark winter. The air in the fermentation cellar would soon be filled with the gentle bubbling sounds and the fruity estery aromas of active fermentation, a promise of comfort and cheer. The wort, now cooled and safely tucked away in its fermentation vessel, perhaps a series of large, imposing oak tuns lined up in the dim coolness of the monastery cellar, has received its vital spark, the yeast. For a little while, nothing much seems to happen. It's a period of quiet anticipation, a brewing interlude where the invisible is at work. The monks have done their part, the malting, the mashing, the boiling, the hopping, the cooling. Now it's up to those microscopic fungi to perform their ancient alchemical dance. Then, slowly at first, signs of life begin to appear. A few bubbles break the surface of the wort. A thin, wispy foam starts to gather. This is the lag phase, where the yeast cells are waking up, acclimating to their new sugary environment, and beginning to reproduce, building up their numbers for the main event. And then, the fermentation truly kicks off. The surface of the wort becomes a hive of activity, a bubbling, churning, frothing mass. A thick, rocky cap of foam, called a croissant or rock, forms on top, sometimes so vigorous it threatens to overflow the fermenter. This is the visual spectacle of yeast hard at work, devouring the sugars created during the mashing process and converting them into two primary products: alcohol, specifically ethanol, and carbon dioxide. The CO2 gas is what causes all the bubbling and frothing, a visible sign of the invisible transformation taking place within. The temperature in the fermentation cellar would be carefully, if rudimentarily, controlled. Too cold, and the yeast would become sluggish and might not ferment fully. Too warm, and the yeast could produce excessive amounts of undesirable flavor compounds, fusel alcohols, which can taste harsh or solvent-like, or overly fruity esters. The ideal temperature for ale yeast, as we know, is generally in that 1822 Celsius range. Medieval monks would have relied on the natural insulation of their stone cellars, perhaps using straw or cloths to further insulate the tuns if it was particularly cold, or venting the cellar if it got too warm during a vigorous fermentation, which itself generates some heat. It's another testament to their observational skills and their ability to work with natural processes. During this active fermentation, which might last for several days to a week or more, depending on the strength of the wort, the yeast, and the temperature, the character of the liquid is profoundly changing. The intense sweetness of the wort gradually diminishes as the sugars are consumed. The alcohol content rises. A whole host of other flavor compounds are also being produced by the yeast. Esters that can give fruity notes like banana, apple, or pear. Phenols that might contribute spicy or clove-like characteristics, especially with certain yeast strains, though these were less common or understood as distinct strains back then. The specific house blend of wild yeasts and bacteria, if that's what they were relying on, would create a unique and complex flavor profile, inimitable to that particular monastery. Remember that God is good, the balm skimmed from a previous batch. That was their living link to consistent, or at least somewhat predictable flavor. And this brings us to the different types of beer the monks would brew. They weren't just making one generic monk ale. They were sophisticated enough to produce a range of beers suited for different purposes and different palates within the monastic community and for their guests. The strongest and finest beer was often reserved for the abbot, important guests, and for celebratory occasions or feast days. This would be the abbot's best, or sometimes referred to generically as prima melia, first best. It would likely have been brewed from the rich first runnings of the wort, possibly with a more generous hopping rate and allowed to mature for longer. It would be higher in alcohol, richer in flavor, a truly premium product. You can imagine the abbot, a man of considerable standing and responsibility, enjoying a well-deserved goblet of his special brew after a long day of managing the monastery's spiritual and temporal affairs. Then there would be the everyday beer for the monks, themselves the conventus beer or table beer. This would be a more moderate strength ale, nourishing and refreshing, but not so strong as to impede their daily duties of prayer and work. St. Benedict's Heminer allowance likely referred to this sort of beer. It would be the staple, the liquid bread that accompanied their meals and provided essential hydration and calories. This might be brewed from a mix of first and second runnings, or entirely from second runnings, resulting in a lighter, more quaffable brew. Think of it as their daily driver, reliable and ever-present. Finally, there was often a small beer, or secunda, second, or even tertia, third beer. This was a very weak ale, brewed from the later runnings of the mash, the spargings, where much of the sugar had already been extracted. Small beer had a very low alcohol content, often just enough to ensure it was safer than water. This was the beer given to servants, lay workers on the monastic estates, the poor who came to the monastery gates seeking alms, and sometimes even to children, as we mentioned before. It was a way of extending the monastery's resources, ensuring everyone had access to a relatively safe drink, even if it wasn't the abbot's prized vintage. Historians still argue whether the production of these distinct grades of beer was primarily driven by economic considerations, getting the most out of the ingredients, or by a hierarchical social structure within and around the monastery. Likely, it was a blend of both practical thrift and established custom. The fermentation vessels themselves are a quirky point of interest. While oak was common, some monasteries, particularly those with a long and unbroken brewing tradition, might have had fermentation tuns that had been in use for generations. The wood itself would have become impregnated with the monastery's unique house yeast culture. These vessels were almost sacred objects, the living heart of their brewing tradition. Cleaning them would have been done carefully, not so aggressively, as to eradicate the beneficial microbes, but enough to prevent outright spoilage. It was a fine line, maintaining the good bugs while discouraging the bad ones. Some tales even suggest that a new brewery might try to obtain a piece of wood, or even just some scrapings, from an old respected brewery's fermenter to try and inoculate their own vessels with a desirable yeast culture, an early form of microbial sharing. As the vigorous primary fermentation subsides, the bubbling slows, and the kreuzen begins to fall back into the beer. The yeast starts to settle out, forming a thick layer at the bottom of the fermenter, for bottom-fermenting lager yeasts, though these were not common in early medieval ales, or sometimes remaining partially in suspension or being skimmed from the top for top-fermenting ale yeasts, which were the norm. The beer is now recognizably beer, albeit green or young beer, not yet fully mature. It has alcohol, it has flavor, it has the promise of winter comfort. The different strengths, the abbot's best, the monk's delight, and the humble small beer, all born from the same initial mash, now stand ready to fulfill their respective roles in the life of the monastery, a testament to the monk's skill in coaxing variety and purpose from grain, water, hops, and the mystical froth of yeast. The cellar is quiet now. The furious bubbling and frothing of active fermentation have subsided. The young beer, in its various strengths and destined for its various drinkers, rests in the cool darkness of the monastic tuns and casks. It's beer, all right. It has alcohol, it has flavour, but it's not quite the finished article. It needs a little time to mature, to condition, to allow the flavours to meld and mellow. But even in its youthful state, this monastic brew is more than just a pleasant beverage, especially as the days grow shorter and the icy grip of winter tightens its hold on the world outside those thick stone walls. This beer becomes something far more profound. It becomes a vital source of sustenance, a liquid loaf in the truest sense of the term. Think about the medieval winter diet, particularly for those engaged in hard physical labour, which many monks were, or for those whose access to a wide variety of fresh foods was severely limited once the last of the autumn harvest was gathered. Fresh fruits and vegetables were a distant memory. Preserved foods, salted meats, dried beans, root vegetables stored in cellars, formed the backbone of their meals. Grain, in the form of bread and porridge, was a staple. But these foods, while providing calories, could be monotonous and sometimes lacking in certain micronutrients. Beer, surprisingly, helped to fill some of these nutritional gaps. Firstly, and most obviously, beer is a source of calories, and in a cold environment, your body burns more calories just trying to stay warm. The alcohol itself provides calories, around 7 calories per gram, but so do the residual unfermented sugars and carbohydrates from the malt. A hearty mug of strong ale could provide a significant caloric boost, welcome fuel for a body battling the chill or engaged in strenuous winter chores like chopping firewood, clearing snow, or tending to sheltered livestock. It's like adding an extra log to your internal fire. You wouldn't want to rely on it as your sole source of nutrition, of course. That would lead to a rather wobbly monastery. But as a supplement, it was invaluable. Beyond just raw calories, beer, especially the unfiltered, less refined beer of the medieval period, contained a surprising amount of goodness. It was rich in B vitamins, thanks to the yeast. Vitamins like thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, pantothenic acid, pyridoxine, and folate are all present in yeast and would be carried over into the beer, particularly if it wasn't filtered too aggressively, which it rarely was. These B vitamins are crucial for energy metabolism, nerve function, and overall health. In a diet that might be lacking in fresh produce, the B vitamins from beer could have played a significant role in preventing deficiency diseases. It's a bit like having a built-in multivitamin in your pint. Beer also contained minerals, leached from the malt and the brewing water. Calcium, magnesium, potassium, phosphorus, all essential for bodily functions, would be present. Even small amounts of trace elements could be found. Again, in a limited winter diet, every little bit helped. The spent grains from the mashing process, by the way, weren't wasted either. They were a valuable animal feed, rich in protein and fibre, ensuring that the monastery's cows or pigs also benefited from the brewing cycle. It was a very circular, efficient system. Then there's the liquid bread aspect. Beer was often referred to as such not just because of the shared ingredient of grain or the barm used in baking, but because it genuinely provided a form of digestible, easily assimilated nourishment. For the elderly, the sick, or those with poor dentition, which was common, a nourishing pint of ale might be easier to consume and digest than a coarse loaf of bread. The infirmer or monk, responsible for the care of the sick, would have undoubtedly seen well-brewed ale as part of his medicinal toolkit, a restorative tonic to help patients regain strength. Historians still argue about the extent to which specific herbal additions to monastic beers, beyond hops or grute, were intentionally medicinal, aiming to treat particular ailments. While some undoubtedly were, the inherent nutritional value of the base beer itself was a primary benefit. Consider the Lenten fasts. During Lent, the period of penitence leading up to Easter, monks, and indeed many lay people, would observe strict dietary restrictions, often abstaining from meat, dairy, and eggs. This could be a long, lean period, especially if winter stores were dwindling. However, liquids were often permitted, or at least viewed with more leniency. And strong, nourishing beers, like the German Doppelbock, literally double box, famously brewed by monks, were seen as a legitimate way to sustain oneself during these austere fasts. The saying, Flüssiges bricht Fasten nicht, liquids, do not break the fast, became a convenient justification for enjoying these hearty brews. The Paulaner monks in Munich, for instance, are legendary for brewing their Salvator Doppelbock specifically to sustain them through Lent. It was their liquid bread when solid bread was restricted. One quirky, though likely apocryphal story, tells of these monks sending a cask of their strong Lenten beer to the Pope for his approval. By the time it arrived in Rome after a long, unrefrigerated journey, it had spoiled so badly that the Pope, tasting it, declared that if the monks wished to drink such an unpleasant penance, they certainly had his blessing. The monks back in Bavaria, blissfully unaware of the state of the sample, happily continued brewing their delicious, sustaining brew. So, when you picture a monk in the depths of winter, huddled in his cell, or perhaps gathered with his brethren, in a common room, if such a luxury existed and was heated, that mug of ale in his hand is far more than a mere indulgence. Its warmth, its calories, its vitamins, its hydration, it's a taste of the harvest carefully preserved and transformed. It's a shield against the gnawing hunger and the biting cold. It's a tangible result of their communities' hard work throughout the year, from ploughing the fields to tending the kiln, from mashing the grain to guiding the fermentation. Each sip was a reminder of their self-sufficiency, their ingenuity, and the blessed bounty that, with God's grace and their own skilled hands, they could produce even when the world outside was frozen and seemingly barren. This liquid loaf was truly a winter feast, a vital component in the monastic art of survival. So, we've journeyed with the barley from the sun-drenched fields through the transformative mysteries of the malt house into the sweet-smelling steam of the mash tun, and past the bubbling, hop-infused fervour of the boil. We've witnessed the anxious wait as the wort cooled, and the almost magical moment when yeast began its silent, powerful work. Now, with the beer maturing in the cellars, providing that liquid loaf so crucial for winter survival, let's take a step back and look at the physical space where much of this alchemy happened, the monastic brewhouse. This wasn't just some forgotten shed at the edge of the monastery grounds. The brewhouse, or brassatorium as it might be called in Latin records, was a vital organ of the monastic body, a hub of specialized knowledge, constant activity, and no small amount of heat and steam. Imagine stepping inside. Even in winter, the brewhouse would likely be one of the warmer places in the monastery, thanks to the fires needed for kilning the malt and boiling the wort. The air would be thick with a complex tapestry of aromas, the sweet, biscuity scent of malt, the earthy tang of sprouting grain from the malting floor, if it was integrated or nearby, the herbal resinous notes of hops, the underlying dampness of stone and wood, and perhaps a faint, yeasty, fruity aroma lingering from previous fermentation activities. It would be a sensory overload compared to the austere quiet of the chapel or the chilly scriptorium. You'd hear the crackle of fires, the bubbling of cauldrons, the rhythmic clang of tools, the slosh of liquids being transferred, and the low murmur of monks coordinating their tasks. This was a place of industry, a sacred workshop dedicated to a very practical craft. The layout of a monastic brewhouse would have been designed for efficiency, evolving over centuries of practice. There wasn't a single blueprint, of course. Designs varied based on the size of the monastery, its wealth, the local building traditions, and the scale of its brewing operations. However, certain key areas and pieces of equipment would be common. You'd have the malt house, perhaps as a distinct but connected building, or a dedicated area within the brewhouse complex. This would include the steeping tanks, the germination, floor, and the all-important kiln for drying the malt. The kiln itself might be a substantial structure, with its firebox below and a perforated floor above where the malt was spread. Access to a good supply of fuel, wood, peat, or charcoal, was essential for the kiln. Then there would be the milling area, where the dried malt was crushed. This might house one or more quernstones or a small grist mill. Nearby, you'd find the mash tuns. These could be very large, especially in monasteries that brewed significant quantities of ale, perhaps to supply not only their own community, but also numerous guests, pilgrims, and dependents. Access to a plentiful supply of good water was paramount, so the brewhouse was often sited near a well, a spring, or a river. Channels or pipes might bring water directly into the brewhouse. There's a famous 9th century plan of the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland, a sort of idealized architectural drawing of a Benedictine monastic complex. This plan clearly shows not just one, but 3 breweries. One for guests, one for the monks themselves, and one for pilgrims and the poor, each with its own malthouse and ancillary buildings. This illustrates the sheer importance and scale of brewing in a major monastic centre. It wasn't an afterthought, it was integral to their infrastructure. Next to the mash tuns, you'd find the brewing kettles, or coppers, the vessels where the wort was boiled with hops. These were often the most expensive pieces of equipment in the brewery, especially if made of copper, which was prized for its excellent heat conductivity and durability. A large copper kettle was a significant investment, a sign of a prosperous brewing operation. Fires would blaze beneath these kettles, demanding constant attention to maintain the correct rolling boil. The coolship room, as we discussed, would be another distinct area designed for airflow, where the hot wort could be laid out in shallow vessels to cool. And finally, the fermentation cellars, often located below ground to maintain a stable, cool temperature, would house the fermentation tuns and, later, the casks for maturation and storage. These cellars would be dark, damp, and filled with the earthy, yeasty aromas of beer in progress. The monks who worked in the brewhouse were skilled craftsmen. The brassitor, or head brewer, would have been a figure of considerable importance and expertise within the monastery. He would have understood the entire process, from selecting the barley to judging the fermentation. He might have had a team of other monks or lay brothers working under him, each responsible for specific tasks: malting, milling, stoking fires, cleaning vessels. Remember Brother Odo from that slightly embellished tale of discovering a new strain of yeast by accidentally leaving his sandals near the fermenters. While perhaps apocryphal, it hints at the idea of dedicated brewery monks. This wasn't a job for just any monk. It required knowledge, experience, and a certain knack. Historians still debate the extent to which brewing knowledge was formally recorded in monastic texts versus being passed down primarily through oral tradition and apprenticeship from one generation of brewer monks to the next. It was likely a combination, with practical experience being paramount. Cleanliness, or at least a medieval approximation of it, was also crucial in the brewhouse. While they didn't have chemical sanitizers, monks understood that dirty vessels could lead to spoiled beer. So, a lot of time and effort would have been spent scrubbing tuns, kettles, and tools with hot water, sand, and perhaps abrasive bundles of twigs or straw. A well-run brewhouse was a clean brewhouse, relatively speaking. One quirky fact: some monastic rules specifically allocated extra rations of food or drink to those monks engaged in particularly arduous or unpleasant tasks, and working in the hot, steamy, and sometimes smoky conditions of the brewhouse, or scrubbing out massive sticky fermenters, might well have qualified. The brewhouse was more than just a production facility. It was a place where science, as they understood it, met craft. It was a place of transformation, where humble ingredients were turned into something valuable, nourishing, and even joyful. It represented the monastery's commitment to self-sufficiency, its ability to provide for its own needs, and to extend hospitality to others. The rhythmic work, the careful attention to detail, the reliance on natural processes, all of this would have been imbued with a sense of purpose, even a spiritual dimension. Ora et labora, prayer and work. Brewing was undeniably work, and for the monks who toiled in the brewhouse, it was their way of contributing to the life and well-being of their community, their own form of service. The heart of the monastery might have been the chapel, but its warm, beating pulse of sustenance often emanated from the brewhouse. The beer is brewed, maturing in the cellars, a comforting promise against the winter's chill. The abbot has his special reserve, the monks have their daily sustenance, and even the monastery's dependents are provided for with small beer. But the reach of monastic ale often extended beyond the immediate needs of the community living within those stone walls. Hospitality, as we've touched upon, was a sacred duty enshrined in the rule of Saint Benedict. Let all guests who arrive be received as Christ. And what better way to welcome a weary traveller shaking off the snow and road dust than with a warming mug of nourishing ale? Monasteries were often situated along important travel routes or in remote areas where other forms of shelter and sustenance were scarce. They functioned as the medieval equivalent of hotels, service stations, and sometimes even community centres, all rolled into one. Pilgrims journeying to holy shrines, merchants conducting trade, knights and nobles travelling. With their retinues, even kings and queens on royal progresses, all might seek lodging and refreshment at a monastery, and the monks were obliged to provide for them, to the best of their ability. This wasn't just a casual offer of a spare room, it was a structured part of monastic life. Most monasteries had a dedicated guest house, or hospitium, often located near the main gate, sometimes even outside the main enclosure, to accommodate lay visitors without unduly disturbing the monastic routine. The guest house would have its own staff, perhaps a hospitaller monk specifically charged with the care of guests, and a key part of that care was providing food and drink. Given that water was often unreliable and wine might be expensive or unavailable in northern regions, good ale from the monastery's own brewhouse was the perfect offering. It was safe, it was nourishing, and it was a tangible expression of Christian charity and welcome. You can imagine a traveller, arriving half-frozen like you did, being ushered into the relative warmth of the guest house, and a lay brother, or serving, monk soon appearing with a steaming bowl of pottage and a foaming tankard of ale. The relief, the gratitude, would have been immense. It was a taste of civilization, of care in a harsh world. This offering of beer wasn't just for the wealthy or important guests. The rule emphasized hospitality to all, especially the poor and pilgrims, for in them, more particularly, Christ is received. So, the monastery gates were often a place where the local poor could come for alms, which might include not just bread, but also a measure of that weaker, but still wholesome, small beer. In times of famine or hardship, the monastery's brewery could be a literal lifesaver for the surrounding community, providing a source of calories and relatively safe hydration when other resources failed. This charitable distribution of beer helped to cement the monastery's role as a vital social and economic hub, fostering goodwill and fulfilling its Christian obligations. Beyond direct hospitality, monastic beer also played a role in the wider economy. Some larger, well-established monasteries with productive breweries and extensive agricultural lands began to produce beer not just for their own needs and for guests, but also for sale. This was particularly true in areas where there wasn't a strong secular brewing tradition, or where the quality of monastic beer was recognized as superior. The monks, with their literacy, their meticulous record-keeping, and their systematic approach to brewing, honed over generations, were often at the forefront of brewing technology and quality control. They weren't just winging it, they were refining their recipes, improving their techniques, and producing a consistent, reliable product. This reputation for quality meant that monastic ales could command a good price in local markets. The income generated from beer sales could then be used to support the monastery's other charitable works, to maintain its buildings, to purchase books for the library, or to acquire land. It became part of the complex economic engine that sustained these large institutions. Historians still debate the extent to which commercial brewing by monasteries was seen as a deviation from the ideal of monastic poverty and self-sufficiency, versus a pragmatic necessity for survival and for funding their core missions of prayer and charity. For many, it seems the latter view prevailed, especially if the profits were channeled back into the monastery's good works. It was a way for the labora, work aspect of their lives, to directly support the aura, prayer, and their charitable outreach. One quirky example of the economic impact of monastic brewing relates to the rights to sell grut, that herbal mixture used to flavor beer before hops became widespread. In some regions, the church or specific monastic orders held the lucrative monopoly on grut sales. This meant that any brewer, secular or monastic, wanting to make ale had to purchase their grut from the approved source, providing a steady stream of income to the grut rights holder. As hops began to gain popularity, offering a superior alternative, this sometimes led to economic conflict between the established grut monopolists and the proponents of hopped beer. The rise of hopped beer, often championed by monastic brewers who recognized its benefits, played a role in breaking these old monopolies. So, the beer brewed within those hallowed walls wasn't just an internal affair, it flowed outwards, a current of hospitality, charity, and commerce, connecting the monastery to the wider world. It refreshed the pilgrim, sustained the poor, and sometimes even helped to fill the abbey's coffers. Each shared pint was a small act of connection, a symbol of the monastery's role in the social and spiritual fabric of medieval life. As you sit there, perhaps finally being offered your own restorative cup by a kindly, if still mostly silent, Brother Thomas, you can appreciate that this brew carries with it a tradition of generosity that extends far beyond the simple quenching of thirst. It's a pint with a purpose, a pint that has welcomed kings and comforted beggars, a pint that tells a story of community and care, reaching out from the heart of the cloister to touch the lives of many. The cheer it brought wasn't just for the monks, but for anyone who sought refuge or aid at their gates. The beer has been brewed, a testament to months of agricultural toil and skilled craftsmanship in the malt house and brew house. It's been shared with guests, given as alms to the needy, and perhaps even sold to bolster the monastery's finances. But as the deepest, darkest days of winter truly set in, when the wind howls like a famished wolf around the stone buttresses and snowdrifts pile high against the narrow windows, its most immediate and perhaps most cherished role comes to the fore, providing warmth within, a reprieve not just from physical cold, but from the potential gloom and isolation of a medieval winter. Imagine the scene. Outside, the world is a frozen, hostile expanse. Travel is difficult, if not impossible. The days are short, the nights achingly long. For the monks, confined within the monastery walls, the routine of prayer and work continues relentlessly. But even their disciplined minds must have felt the oppressive weight of the season. The chill would seep into the very stones of the building, making the scriptorium a place of blue fingers and chattering teeth. The unheated dormitory, a less than cozy prospect for sleep. Even the chapel, the spiritual heart of their existence, could be a place of profound cold during those long, early morning vigils. In this environment, the simple pleasure and physical comfort of a mug of ale would have been magnified tenfold. It wasn't just about the alcohol content, though the gentle warming effect of a moderate amount of alcohol would certainly have been welcome, helping to dilate blood vessels and create a sensation of inner warmth, however temporary. It was also about the psychological comfort, the ritual, the sense of community it fostered. Picture the monks gathered in the refectory for their main meal of the day. The room itself might be draughty and vast, perhaps warmed slightly by a central hearth if they were fortunate, but still far from snug. The food, while nourishing, might be simple, repetitive winter fare. Pottage, dark bread, perhaps some salted fish or preserved vegetables. And alongside this, a pewter tankard or a simple earthenware cup of their own brewed ale. The very act of raising that cup, the anticipation of the familiar taste, the malty sweetness balanced by hop bitterness, if they were a hop-forward establishment, would have been a small but significant moment of pleasure in a day structured by duty and austerity. The beer itself, often served at cellar temperature rather than icy cold, would feel comforting to cold hands. The first sip, a wave of familiar flavour, a reminder of the harvest, of the community's collective labour. It was something to look forward to, a punctuation mark in the monastic day. It wasn't about boisterous revelry, St. Benedict's, injunction against drunkenness would still hold firm. But a quiet sense of contentment, a shared moment of respite, would have been entirely in keeping with the spirit of communal life. Beyond the refectory, there might have been other moments where ale provided solace, perhaps in the calefactory or warming room, one of the few heated spaces in some monasteries where monks could go to thaw out between their duties. Here, with the welcome glow of a fire, a shared cup of ale among brothers could foster a sense of camaraderie, a moment for quiet, permitted conversation, a brief easing of the usual solemnity. These small pockets of warmth and conviviality would have been islands of comfort in a sea of winter austerity. Historians still argue whether the wassail tradition, a pre-Christian ritual of drinking to health and a good harvest, had any subtle influence or echo in monastic winter drinking customs, even if heavily Christianized. While direct links are tenuous, the innate human desire for communal cheer and warmth during the bleakest time of year is universal. The monastery's ale, brewed from the fruits of their own harvest, certainly embodied a spirit of thankfulness and hope for future abundance. The psychological benefits were as important as the physical. The long dark evenings, with limited light from expensive candles or smoky oil lamps, could be trying. Ale, with its gentle soporific effect, might have helped to ease the monks into sleep in their cold dormitories, a small mercy when true physical comfort was scarce. It could also provide a welcome distraction from the aches and pains that often accompany cold, damp conditions, especially for older monks or those with chronic ailments. One quirky tidbit: some monastic herbals, books detailing the medicinal uses of plants, included recipes for sleeping potions or cordials that often featured ale or wine as a base, infused with various calming herbs like hops, beyond just forbittering, chamomile, or valerian. A nightcap in its truest, most ancient sense. And it wasn't just about individual comfort, but about community spirit. The shared act of producing the beer from field to fermenter was a communal effort. The shared act of consuming it reinforced their bonds. It was their beer, a product of their home, their labor. It was a tangible symbol of their self-sufficiency and their ability to thrive, even in adversity. In a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable, the steady, reliable presence of their daily ale was a small anchor of normalcy and provision. So, as you imagine yourself within those ancient walls, the winter wind rattling the shutters, the snow piling ever higher, you can understand that the ale offered more than just hydration or calories. It offered a warmth that spread from the belly to the soul. It was a small, daily affirmation of life, of community, of the enduring power of human ingenuity and fellowship to make even the harshest season bearable. It was a shield against the desolation of winter, a liquid ember glowing in the heart of the frozen monastery, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness there could be comfort, cheer, and the quiet strength found in a shared cup. The warmth within, provided by that humble monastic brew, was a crucial ingredient for surviving. Not just the physical cold, but the winter of the spirit as well. The long winter is finally beginning to loosen its icy grip. Patches of stubborn snow still cling to the shaded corners of the cloister garth, but the sun, when it appears, carries a new, tentative warmth. The days are perceptibly lengthening, and the first brave shoots of green might be appearing in the monastery gardens. The great brewing campaigns that sustained the community through the darkest months are perhaps winding down, the last of the strong winter ales being savoured, and thoughts turning towards lighter brews for the coming spring and summer. As you prepare to leave the sanctuary of these ancient walls, it's time to reflect on the enduring legacy of those medieval monks and their remarkable brewing traditions. The echoes of their craft, their dedication, and their ingenuity resonate even now in the beers we enjoy today. It's easy to romanticize the past, to picture these monks as saintly figures effortlessly producing divine ales. The reality, as we've explored, was one of hard work, constant challenges, and a reliance on empirical knowledge painstakingly acquired over generations. They didn't have fancy stainless steel equipment, precise temperature controls, or laboratories full of microbiologists. They worked with wood, stone, and rudimentary tools, battling inconsistent ingredients, unpredictable wild yeasts, and the constant threat of spoilage. Yet, despite these limitations, or perhaps because of them, they laid a profound foundation for the art and science of brewing. One of the most significant legacies is their meticulous approach. Monks, particularly those in orders like the Benedictines and Cistercians, were often literate, organized, and accustomed to detailed record-keeping for managing their estates and scriptoria. They brought this same diligence to their brewhouses. While many specific brewing recipes from the early medieval period might be lost to time, the ethos of careful observation, of noting what worked and what didn't, and of striving for consistency was a hallmark of monastic brewing. This systematic approach helped to elevate brewing from a haphazard domestic chore to a respected craft. They were, in a very real sense, some of the earliest brewing scientists, even if they wouldn't have used that term. Historians still argue about the directness of the lineage, but it's plausible that the detailed agricultural and craft records kept by monasteries provided a knowledge base that later secular brewers could draw upon as brewing guilds and commercial breweries developed. Their role in the cultivation and popularization of hops in many parts of Europe is undeniable. While hops had been known and used sporadically for centuries, monastic gardens were often at the forefront of cultivating them systematically and understanding their benefits for flavoring and, crucially, preserving beer. By championing beer, monks helped to transform the very nature of the beverage, leading to ales that could travel better, last longer, and offer a more complex and balanced flavor profile than the often unpredictable Gruit ales they gradually replaced. The global beer industry today, with its incredible variety of hop-driven styles, owes a significant debt to those early monastic hop growers and brewers. Furthermore, specific beer styles that are still brewed and celebrated today have their roots deep in monastic tradition. Think of the strong, dark, malty Doppelbocks of Germany, famously first brewed by the Paulaner monks in Munich to sustain them through Lenten fasts. Or consider the rich, complex, and often high-alcohol Trappist and Abbey ales of Belgium. These are not mere historical reenactments. Breweries like Chimay, Rochefort, Orval, Westmalle, and Westvleteren are run by or under the supervision of actual Trappist monks, adhering to strict rules about production within the monastery walls, and using profits for the upkeep of the monastery and charitable causes. These beers are world-renowned for their quality and character, a living link to centuries of monastic brewing expertise. When you sip a Belgian double or triple, you are tasting a direct descendant of the ales perfected within those cloistered walls. The very concept of quality control, however rudimentary, was also advanced by monastic brewers. Their desire for consistency, their understanding of the importance of clean vessels, even if their definition of clean differs from ours, and their careful selection and propagation of yeast from good batches that, God is good, all contributed to a more reliable and higher quality product. This set a standard that others would eventually aspire to. One quirky, and perhaps less direct legacy might be found in the hospitality industry. Monasteries, with their guest houses providing food, drink, and lodging to travelers, were precursors to inns and hotels. The tradition of offering a welcoming pint to a weary guest, so central to monastic hospitality, is a practice that has endured in pubs and taverns for centuries. The very idea of a place of refuge offering good cheer in liquid form has strong monastic undertones. The echoes are there if you know where to listen. They're in the names of beers, in the traditional styles still being lovingly produced, in the very idea of brewing as a craft requiring patience, skill, and respect for ingredients. Those medieval monks, brewing to survive long winters, to offer hospitality, to support their communities, and perhaps simply to enjoy a well-earned pint after a day of prayer and labour, left an indelible mark on the world of beer. They weren't just making a beverage, they were cultivating a tradition, one that valued quality, community, and the careful transformation of nature's bounty. So, the next time you raise a glass of your favourite ale, take a moment. You might just catch a faint, centuries-old echo of a monastic chant, a whisper of gratitude for the sacred suds that helped them, and in turn us, weather the storms. The world outside the monastery walls beckons now. The air is a little softer, the light a little brighter. You carry with you not just the memory of the biting cold, but also the enduring warmth of the monks' ingenuity and their life-giving brew. Their dedication ensured not only their survival through countless harsh winters, but also gifted us a legacy that continues to ferment and flourish, a rich tapestry of flavors and traditions poured into every glass. As you step out from the cool, shadowed archway of the gatehouse blinking in the returning light, the sharp scent of pine from a nearby copse, newly released by the thawing earth, fills your senses. The wind, no longer a howling menace, now carries the distant chirping of birds, a promise of renewal. The memory of the dark, silent cold of your arrival is now overlaid with the lingering aroma of malt and hops, the faint, ghostly echo of chanting, and the profound, quiet industry of those who found solace and sustenance in the heart of their brewhouse. The winter, both literal and metaphorical, has been weathered, in no small part thanks to the wisdom and labour distilled into every drop of monastic ale. The enduring spirit of that craft, that careful, patient transformation of simple grain into liquid comfort, is a warmth that travels with you, a quiet hum beneath the surface of the world, long after the last snowflake has melted. The journey through the medieval monastery, through the chill of winter, and into the warmth of the brewhouse, now gently draws to a close. You felt the biting wind, sought refuge within ancient stones, and understood how a simple, humble brew could become a source of life, comfort, and community. The rhythmic chants fade, the clatter of the brewery recedes, and the rich scent of molten hops softens into the quiet air of your own familiar space. Allow the images to linger, but softly now, like embers glowing in a distant hearth. The resilience of those monks, their dedication to ora et labora, their quiet ingenuity in coaxing warmth and sustenance from the cold earth and simple grains. These are stories that have now become a gentle part of your own evening. Let the steady, patient rhythm of their lives, the turning of the seasons mirrored in the brewing cycle, lull you into a state of peaceful repose. There are no more tasks to complete, no more challenges to face tonight. Only the soft embrace of stillness. The world outside your window continues its own quiet turn. But here, in this moment, there is only calm. The echoes of history are now just whispers, inviting you to rest, to drift. Let go of the day, and allow the gentle tide of sleep to carry you. May your dreams be peaceful, and your rest deep and restorative. Sweet dreams.